When Olivia moved in with Mark, she thought she had found the man who would help her start over. He was a widower, mourning a wife he claimed had died in a tragic accident. But soon, Olivia began noticing things that didn't add up, small details that raised questions. Then one night, a discovery would force her to face the truth. Mark's past wasn't what he said it was. And that truth would push Olivia into a life-or-death situation. Olivia was starting over. After a painful breakup, she found herself searching for a fresh start, and when she met Mark, everything seemed to fall into place. He was everything she needed: caring, supportive, and seemingly broken by the loss of his wife, Emily. Mark's story was one of love lost too soon. He told Olivia how Emily had died in a car accident years ago, and how he'd been left to carry the weight of that grief. He spoke about his wife with such emotion, it was impossible not to feel for him. Olivia believed in his pain, believed that he was still healing. Mark's home felt like a sanctuary. The walls seemed to hold echoes of a past she could only imagine. Everything about him seemed genuine, except for a few details that didn't sit right with Olivia. A small photograph of Mark and Emily tucked away in the corner of the living room. The picture frame was old, worn. She noticed it one evening, just sitting there, nothing strange about it, yet something about it made her pause. Mark hadn't mentioned it before, but she assumed it was a sentimental piece. The next few days, she began to notice other things. Odd, unexplained moments that seemed harmless at first, but, over time, became harder to ignore. Every now and then, when Mark thought she wasn't looking, Olivia would catch him staring at the photograph. His gaze was different from before. It wasn't filled with sadness like the first time she saw him look at it. It was cold, calculating. But Olivia didn't say anything. She wasn't sure what to think. Maybe it was nothing. After all, who wouldn't be affected by the death of their spouse? But there was always this nagging feeling, a quiet voice in the back of her mind telling her there was more to Mark's story than he was letting on. As time passed, the initial comfort of Mark's home began to fade for Olivia. Things she hadn't noticed before started to stand out. It was the little things at first, nothing she could really explain. A picture frame, for example. It was always off-center, just enough to catch her eye. Every time she walked by, it seemed to mock her. She would straighten it, only to find it askew again the next day. Mark would always say he never noticed, brushing it off with a smile, but it became harder to ignore. It wasn't just the frame. It was the small, strange inconsistencies in the way things were placed around the house. They weren't huge, but they left Olivia feeling uneasy. Then there was the locked drawer in Mark's bedroom. He'd told her it was nothing, just old keepsakes and things he didn't want cluttering the house. But whenever Olivia asked about it, Mark's tone would shift, just a little. Not enough to make her question him outright, but enough to make her wonder why he was so protective of it. She never tried to force it open, but she couldn't help but feel like there was something he didn't want her to see. The feeling grew stronger as days went by. At night, when Mark was working late or out of town, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, though she never saw anyone. The house, once so welcoming, began to feel different, larger, colder. The walls seemed to echo her footsteps when she walked alone, as if they held secrets she wasn't meant to uncover. One evening, as Olivia settled into the routine of her new life, something happened that she couldn't ignore. From the kitchen window, she saw a figure standing at the edge of the backyard. A woman, motionless, staring directly into their house. At first, Olivia thought it was just a neighbor, perhaps out for a walk or casually passing by. But the woman didn't move. She just stood there, her eyes locked on the house on them. Olivia froze, unsure whether to confront her or turn away. It wasn't until Mark came in from the other room that she turned back to look, only to see the woman was gone. When Olivia mentioned it to Mark later, he didn't seem concerned. Just a nosy neighbor, he shrugged, dismissing it with a laugh. He didn't even glance out the window. But Olivia couldn't shake the feeling. Something about the woman's stillness, her quiet watchfulness, seemed too deliberate to be ignored. It was as though she was waiting for something or someone. But what? And why? The thought nagged at Olivia, lingering in her mind long after Mark had put it behind him. Every time Olivia walked past the kitchen window after that night, her eyes would instinctively search the backyard, half expecting to see the woman again. But each time, the space remained empty, leaving her to wonder if she had imagined it, or if something else was going on, something Mark wasn't telling her. Olivia could no longer ignore the feeling that something was wrong. The image of the woman in the backyard lingered in her mind, unanswered questions growing by the day. One evening, when Mark was away on a business trip, Olivia decided to follow her instincts. She needed to know the truth. Her heart raced as she watched the woman from her window, waiting for the right moment. As the woman stepped into the street, Olivia carefully followed from a distance, moving quietly through the shadows. She trailed the woman across town, keeping a careful distance, not sure where this would lead. Her curiosity turned to dread as they reached the outskirts of the city. The woman led her down a quiet street to a modest home, tucked away from the bustle of the neighborhood. Olivia hesitated for a moment, but pushed forward, drawn by something she couldn't explain. She watched as the woman entered the house, and then, after a brief pause, Olivia followed. The door was unlocked. Olivia crept inside, her breath catching in her throat. What she found inside would change everything. The room was filled with photographs of Mark and his wife, Emily. Their wedding photos, their smiling faces frozen in time. But it wasn't just the pictures that took her breath away. On the table, neatly arranged, were two sets of wedding rings, one of them identical to her own. Olivia's mind raced as she realized what this meant. Emily wasn't dead. She had never been in that car accident Mark had described. Emily was alive, and Mark had been lying to her the entire time. Olivia's legs shook beneath her as the truth sank in. She couldn't believe what she had just uncovered. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on the familiar faces, the rings, the life that had been stolen from Emily and turned into a lie. Everything she had been told, everything she had trusted, now seemed like a carefully constructed illusion. Olivia stood frozen, the weight of what she had just uncovered sinking in. The photographs, the rings, it all pointed to one undeniable truth. Mark had lied. He hadn't lost his wife in a tragic accident. Emily was never dead. As Olivia's eyes scanned the room, it became clear. Mark had staged Emily's death, carefully orchestrating the entire story. He had collected her life insurance, and then, as if nothing had happened, he moved on. And somewhere in the process, he'd found Olivia, another woman to deceive, another life to manipulate. The pieces clicked together in her mind. Mark had never stopped controlling the narrative, never stopped lying. He had built a life around Olivia's trust, all while hiding his past. Every word he had told her, every confession of heartbreak and sorrow, had been part of a performance. It wasn't grief he had been carrying. It was a lie he had perfected. Olivia's stomach churned. She had trusted him. She had believed in his pain, shared in it, and now it felt like the rug had been pulled from under her. Mark had used her, just as he had used Emily, and just as he had used everyone who had ever come into his life. And the most chilling part? He had never intended to stop. He had moved on to the next victim, Olivia. The reality of the situation hit her like a cold wave. Mark hadn't been just a grieving widower. He had been a master manipulator, playing every part to his advantage. Olivia knew one thing for certain. Mark's dark past was only the beginning of a nightmare she hadn't signed up for. Everything she thought she understood about their relationship, everything she believed to be true, was built on a lie. And now, with this discovery, she couldn't ignore the fact that she had been living in a world of deception, a world where she was nothing more than another pawn in Mark's twisted game. Mark hadn't just been hiding his wife's death. He had been planning all of this from the start. Olivia wasn't just another woman to him. She was a replacement, a means to an end. And now that the truth was out, she had no idea how far he was willing to go to keep his secret safe. When Olivia confronted Mark about what she had discovered, the shock and anger in her voice were undeniable. She laid out everything: his lies, the photos, the rings, every piece of evidence she had found. But Mark didn't react the way she expected. He didn't show guilt or surprise. Instead, he smiled darkly, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. "You really think I'd let you get away with this?" Mark said, his tone cold. He wasn't even trying to defend himself, only acknowledging the elaborate scam he had carried out. His words were almost too casual, as though he had been preparing for this confrontation long before she had figured it out. Olivia's breath caught in her throat as the full extent of his manipulation sank in. She had trusted him. She had believed every word he said, every tear he shed. And now, standing before her was a man who had used her, just like he had used Emily. But as Olivia reached for her phone, her mind racing with plans to call the police, Mark stepped forward, blocking her path. His smile faded, replaced by something much darker. He reached into his pocket, and in that moment, Olivia froze. Before she could react, Mark revealed his own deadly secret: a gun tucked beneath his jacket. The sight of it took her breath away. "You really thought you could just walk away from this, didn't you?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through the tension in the room. Olivia's heart raced as she took a step back, panic surging through her veins. She had no idea how far Mark was willing to go to protect his lies, but in that moment, she knew she was in far more danger than she ever could have imagined. As Olivia stepped back, trying to create distance, Mark's cold gaze never left her. The weight of the gun in his hand was impossible to ignore, its presence filling the room with a threat she hadn't fully understood until now. Mark took another step forward, his smile never fading, as if the control he once had over their relationship had shifted into something far more dangerous. "You were never meant to find out," he said, his voice calm, almost detached. "But now, you'll be just another casualty in my plan." Olivia's blood ran cold. The words hung in the air, a chilling reminder of how deeply he had manipulated her. The truth was clear now. Everything had been a game to Mark. His lies, his grief, his charm, none of it had been real. He had used it all to manipulate her, to trap her in his web. And now, faced with the consequences of his actions, he was ready to take things further. The room seemed to close in around her as Mark raised the gun, his finger hovering over the trigger. Olivia's mind raced. She had no way out. She couldn't run, couldn't call for help. Mark had planned every move with precision. Every breath she took felt like it could be her last. But in that moment, a surge of determination washed over Olivia. She wasn't going to let him win. Not like this. With every ounce of strength she had, she lunged for the nearest object, a heavy lamp sitting on the table beside her. She grabbed it and swung it at Mark, knocking the gun out of his hand. The sound of metal clattering to the floor was deafening, but Olivia couldn't stop now. She pushed forward, every instinct telling her to act before it was too late. In the split second after the lamp hit Mark, everything around Olivia blurred into chaos. Her heart pounded in her ears as she grabbed his arm, trying to push him away. The gun had fallen, but Mark was still a threat. Every movement from him was filled with cold fury. His grip tightened around her wrist, pulling her closer, and she knew that one wrong move could be her last. But Olivia wasn't thinking about that. In that moment, all her instincts took over. She didn't hesitate. She kicked him hard in the stomach, breaking his hold just long enough to make a run for it. Her feet hit the floor as she bolted toward the door, her mind racing with one thought: escape. Mark wasn't far behind. Olivia heard his footsteps close in, but she couldn't stop now. She lunged for the door, slamming it open, but Mark was faster. He grabbed her shoulder, spinning her around, his rage now unmistakable in his eyes. "You really think you can get away from me?" he growled. Olivia's pulse raced as she fought to break free, using every ounce of energy to shove him back. With a surge of desperation, she drove her elbow into his side, giving herself just enough space to push him back further. She didn't have much time. She could hear him cursing behind her, the sound of his footsteps following her as she sprinted out the door, onto the front porch. The gun was still on the floor just inside. Olivia knew she had one chance to survive. She spun around, grabbed the gun, and pointed it toward Mark. His eyes widened, but he didn't stop. Olivia's hand trembled, but her voice was steady when she said, "Stay back." Mark took another step forward, his mouth twisted in a mocking smile. "You won't shoot me," he sneered. But Olivia wasn't listening anymore. In a flash, she pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed in the night air, louder than she could have imagined. Mark froze, his expression changing in an instant, from anger to disbelief. He stumbled back, his hand clutching at his chest. He tried to speak, but no words came. His body crumpled to the ground, falling in slow motion as the shock of his own mortality settled in. Olivia stood there, breathless, the gun still aimed at him, her entire body shaking. It was over. Mark was no longer a threat, but Olivia wasn't sure what had just happened. The weight of the moment was too much. She had done what she had to do, but the reality of it all hit her like a wave, leaving her standing in the silence, trying to make sense of what she had just survived. In the aftermath of the confrontation, Olivia's life was changed forever. She survived, but the trauma of discovering the truth and the violence she had to endure would haunt her for years to come. The police arrived at the scene, their presence a stark reminder of how far things had gone. Mark was dead, and there would be no justice for him. His reign of deception ended with a single pull of the trigger. The investigation revealed the full extent of his lies. It came to light that Mark had staged Emily's death, used her life insurance for personal gain, and manipulated everyone around him. Though Mark was no longer a threat, the damage was done. He was gone, but Olivia was left with a lifetime of questions and uncertainty. What had driven Mark to such extremes? Was Emily an unwitting victim in all of this, or had she played a part in her own disappearance? The truth about Emily's involvement, if any, remained unanswered, leaving Olivia to wonder whether she had been caught in a web spun by Mark alone, or if there was something darker at play. In the days that followed, Olivia faced the daunting task of rebuilding her life. Mark's death had ended the immediate danger, but the emotional scars lingered. The betrayal, the lies, the fear, these were the things that would stay with her. She had learned the truth, but the price had been high, and moving forward would never be as simple as it once seemed. What do you think? Did Olivia do the right thing? How would you have reacted if you were in her shoes? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you found this story as shocking as we did, don't forget to hit the like button. If you want to hear more gripping true crime stories, make sure you subscribe and click the bell so you don't miss out on our next video.